Hello, everyone. Welcome to the largest room for the smallest group. This will be, hopefully, the least dense conference you'll ever be. I think it's good from a social distancing perspective. You're fine. I'm Matt Kozlov. I am with Techstars. We are the most active pre-seed and seed stage investor in the world, which also carries to our investment portfolio in space. We're I think the single or the second most active space investor in North America. We have been investing in the category for close to 8 years now. Some of our better known companies, we actually have Daniel Faber at Orbit Fab on the stage. We have a company called Pixel Space. We have a company called Morpheus Space, Xeno Power Systems, Kepler Communications, Slingshot Aerospace. We have, I think, over a dozen companies worth 100 million or more. That's just in our space portfolio. In 2019, we launched our very first entirely space-focused fund and accelerator program in partnership with NASA's Jet Propulsion Lab and the United States Space Force, which we continue to run today. We will actually be running that program in the fall. We have 1 or 2 slots left in that program if there are any early stage companies in the audience today that we should be talking to. But today's conversation is about overcoming the cold start problem. And we define that as a particularly hard business that you're trying to get off the ground that may be capital intensive, but may be hard to raise capital without much traction. And so how do you actually overcome that chicken and egg problem? You know, most of us, I don't think, are billionaires. And so for those of us who are not, that can't just immediately tap into 20, 40, 100, $200 million, how do we break this big chunky problem that we're trying to solve into smaller bite-sized pieces that we can make progress on and ultimately hit all the milestones and get the traction we need to de-risk things for the investors along the way and actually get to our end game. And so today we have a phenomenal panel. We have representatives from our partners at Space Force and JPL, as well as our investor in residence, Sherman Williams, who can give you more of a traditional VC perspective, and 2 of our founders, Daniel Faber at Orbit Fab and Zeke Brechtel at Prewitt Ridge. So with that, I will hand it over to my colleagues to give a little bit of background on themselves. So Cody, do you want to introduce yourself? And I'm going to sit down.
Great, yeah, thank you. Cody Bronkar with SpaceWERX, manage all the venture capital relationships and strategic partnerships. And so SpaceWERX, just generally speaking, close to $500 million in non-dilutive SBIR funding. So that's what we execute on behalf of Space Force. And then we use partners like some on the panel and then elsewhere across the globe to help transition companies. We traditionally look a little bit more on the earlier side so that we can help companies kind of get the initial dollars in capital that they need to get stood up and then kind of transition some of the partnerships that they've established early on into larger contracts with some of those partnerships. So glad to be here, thanks.
Ian?
Great, yeah, Ian McCubbin, Jet Propulsion Laboratory. I'm the VC and Startup Engagement Manager in our Chief Technologist Office. JPL is the original space startup. We've been doing it for 87 years at this point. But what we've been watching is an evolving landscape in the last 5 years. I remember doing the first startup Techstars event back in 2019, not knowing what an accelerator was and really wondering where are we going with this commercial business. Huge successes out of that. JPL and NASA is very interested in what's evolving. Obviously, the Space Force and the DoD is investing very heavily. NASA's watching a little more carefully, but we have strategic partnerships through SBIR, Ignite, programs like that, CLP CLIPS program, where we've made investments in these startups and we're starting to see those mature. So it's more a watch and help kind of approach. And so we've had some real successes with pilot programs and startups. And actually, I just got a $2.6 million award with one of the company's Urban Skies out of the Techstars. We actually got a NASA grant and wrote a NASA grant for a startup. That was an interesting process. It's a little different to write a grant than it is to do an SBIR, but it was a very rewarding experience in the end. So a lot of success.
Yeah, my name is Sherman Williams. As Matt said, I have a couple different roles. I'm the VC in residence for the Techstars Space Tech program. Full-time, I run a fund with my co-founder, AIN Ventures. It's short for Academy Investor Network. I went to the U.S. Naval Academy. She went to West Point. We're a pre-seed, seed stage deep technology fund that does invest with a dual-use lens. We do invest in space. We have numerous companies in space, but we also invest in a couple of other areas, life sciences, sustainability tech, and AI, ML dev tools. And happy to be here and meet you all.
Daniel Faber, CEO of OrbitFab. 25 years ago, decided getting humans off of Earth and settling space would be an interesting career and something fun to do. My list of industries to pay for permanent jobs in space was tourism and mining. So I've been chipping away at asteroid mining for 25 years. I couldn't see myself as a tour operator, but perhaps asteroid mining is a great example of things that are hard to get off the ground. We're now 25 years closer. OrbitFab is building gas stations in space, the fuel supply chain to refuel satellites, and one day we'd like to be the biggest customer of asteroid and moon mined materials. But right now we build gas caps. We're really a gas cap company. We build interfaces that allow satellites to be refueled in orbit, and we sell fuel for delivery in space.
All right, I'm Zeke, co-founder of Prewitt Ridge. We went through the Techstars 2020 Accelerator. We build digital engineering software, so it's kind of a picks and shovels approach tooling to support companies that are out in space using those actual picks and shovels to mine asteroids and similar sorts of work. We've been around since 2020, and we've gone through the whole gamut of SBIRs, STTRs, raising venture capital funding, and have had that whole experience. So happy to be here today.
Cool. So I have a bunch of questions, but I don't think my questions are inherently better than anyone else's questions. So if anyone on the panel at any point wants to pose a question to the group, and I think there's a QR code somewhere all around the room, I'd love to take your guys' questions as well. But I do want to make this as interactive as possible. So I'm going to kind of like unmoderate myself here. Okay, I'm going to plug Techstars just to explain what we do, because I don't think most people know I say this and I shouldn't take it for granted. So we're a venture fund. We invest capital into companies, but our unusual special sauce is that once we invest in a company, we bring them through this 3-month-long intensive accelerator program, and there are a lot of people who run what they call accelerator programs, but ours is 13 weeks of like crazy business development where we bring in the space program alone, we have about 300 mentors. These are senior executives and officials from the Space Force, from JPL, from NASA Glenn, NASA Ames, from most of the primes, from Series B, C, D startups, from aerospace and defense industry at large. And every one of these 300 people are descending on these 12 companies that we pick for each cycle, and just helping them get as much done as possible, making customer introductions, helping them with grants, helping them find end users within the DoD or within the NASA community or within the DARPA community. And then usually they start taking off and magical things start happening, and then those companies generally raise capital at the end. We play a very active role in helping them raise their next round of capital. In our 2019 cohort that Daniel was in, we had 10 companies, of which 7 wound up raising between $15 and $80 million. And our fun fact that we got from the Space Force a couple months ago is, I think it's like 10% of all the Space Force startup grant funding has gone to Techstars portfolio companies. So like it's working, and that's why we'll continue to do this for as long as I have any say in it. But now I guess I'll hand it over to each of you guys, and you're all either living through or as the person going through this cold start problem, or someone in the supply chain and ecosystem and trying to help these companies get through the cold start problem. So, Cody, tell me your perspective. Like, how does the Space Force work with early stage companies? It's like one of the riskiest categories of potential vendors or potential solutions you could possibly be tapping into, as opposed to the primes or Series C and Series D. So help us understand from a Space Force perspective, or from the Air Force perspective more broadly, like why early stage, and like why is it important, and how are you thinking about risk mitigation?
Yeah, a lot to unpack. I think we're still trying to figure it out, first and foremost. organizations like AFWERX and SpaceWERX, like we were stood up to bridge that gap, right? And I think it's paramount that we execute and then also market that execution well, right? So that we can get more and more companies to apply for the solicitations, which is how we execute those dollars on throughout the year. And so, yeah, we have checks from 75,000 all the way up to collaborative approaches with venture funding and private capital up to 60 million, right? And so, again, we're looking, I would say, a little bit more on the earlier side, but we typically, once they're in our portfolio, right, are very much so hands-on and try and be as conducive as possible to carry each one of them, into transition. And transition is not necessarily a sexy term because transition sometimes looks like getting gobbled up into another company, right? Transition looks like getting sold or whatever it may be, or sometimes just fizzling out, right? And so the government and how we execute those dollars help us de-risk us on the back end by going through the R&D cycle, right? Seeing what works and what doesn't, proving that out very quickly, and that fast-fail approach, and we try and execute on that, I would say, as best as possible. So yeah, SpaceWERX, again, we have a lot of different funding avenues. Again, we work with a bunch of different partners as well to help bridge that gap, but overall, yeah, that's a plug for SpaceWERX because we definitely do a very good job, especially with the smaller team, right? AFWERX has about 170 people. We now have about 40, but we were 5 people for about 2 years. So, yeah.
So I started at Techstars about 9 years ago, and the open topic didn't exist. The the solicitations that I think most of the startups that I've been working with around phase 1 and then phase 2 and then maybe TACFi or StratFi, I don't think those existed 10 years ago. Help me understand how we got to where we are now, and how the Space Force is thinking about what changes are coming. Is it going to be easier or harder to get capital from the DoD going forward from now?
So it's interesting because we've seen kind of in the market as well overall, even I would say looking outside the U.S. and bringing business into the U.S. as well. So we've opened up the aperture there. Phase 1 and phase 2 has been somewhat of a standard execution phase for us. I think we're going to look at transitioning a little bit more towards executing on TACFi, StratFi, so we can help out some of these companies actually transition into program of the record and working with some of our larger primes or even creating other primes. So yeah, I mean, phase 1 and phase 2 is our bread and butter, but we've had discussions very early on of how can we open it up to maybe a 24/7 solicitation, right? And so any company can submit at any point in time throughout the year. These are very early discussions, but these are things that we've talked about of how can we, again, create an ecosystem here that is friendly enough to where when you have technology and you have technology that's ready to come to the government and you have a go-to-market strategy that is solid, come to us, talk to us, and let's figure out how we can get you a contract.
Awesome.
Yeah.
I vote for 24/7. That sounds great.
A lot of people would like that. It's just how do we execute those dollars? There's a lot of logistics to it.
I can imagine. Yeah. All right, Ian, tell me a little bit around JPL, and I know JPL isn't quite a part of NASA, but you work with NASA all the time, so help me understand, how is JPL thinking about startups and the role they play in your mission set and what you're doing to help them succeed, and how does NASA think about it, and are they the same, different?
Yeah, obviously the DoD is much more, has advanced around the startup culture. I don't know if that's because defense tech's been around longer than space tech. There's clearly, the Office of Secretary of Defense has a lot of efforts going towards startups. So I would say it's more advanced over at DoD. At NASA, we're very interested. We've had a lot of successes. We've had a lot of spin-offs. There's been, examples of spin-offs. Colleague from JPL is trying to build a device that's going to use terahertz scanning to scan for guns that go inside of buildings. I think that's a great use of NASA technology. I got 2 kids in elementary school, and we all worry about those sorts of things every day they go to school, which is unfortunate, but that's using NASA technology. That's a spinoff. So there's one example is this question about how do we do spinoffs out of the federal labs? JPL is a federally funded research and development center with our prime contract to NASA. So everything we do goes through NASA. We are considered a NASA center, and we've had a lot of successes. Currently, we're working with Planet Labs and the Carbon Mapper program, which is a nonprofit, which was a spinoff of JPL, and they're building a constellation of hyperspectral satellites to measure methane. So there's an example of how we work with industry. AeroVironment built the rotors that were on the Mars helicopter. There's another example of how we work with small industry and bring them into our missions. Not so much early stage when we're putting it into a mission that's further along companies, but because what is it now? Planet's got an IPO and they're a publicly traded company, but they're considered one of the new space companies. So there's an example. We also work on grants, like I said, with Urban Sky, or there's Tipping Point, there's SBIR Ignite. There's a lot of examples of how you can write a grant to NASA, and JPL will partner in that, like with Tipping Point, to write a proposal that would get awarded. So there's examples of NASA funding where we see a company and we want to evolve that technology. So we're working with that. And so part of our approach of paying attention to the accelerators, the AWS or Techstars or a whole host of them, we're looking at those early stage companies. So we're watching, in 2019, tall redhead guy at the other side of the stage was telling me he was building gas stations in space, and I was like, how is he going to do that? And here he is, he's launching missions with the Space Force, right? So we now know what's going on in that economy. So we're a little bit more where they're strategically deploying capital over the DoD side. We're watching and trying to evolve what's going on in this market in kind of like a Caesar the dog whisperer approach, right? Not so brute force of we're writing checks, but we want to see this evolve because it's happening right now, and it's just amazing what's going on in the new space economy.
I piggyback off that, actually. You said strategically, and that kind of hit home. So yeah, I mean, we execute the dollars based off of the PEO's priorities, right? And so we talk with our government customers. We don't own the priorities, right? So we fund them. And so we go to the customer base and strategically try and align where the US government, and specifically Space Force, is trying to go based off of capability development, and then we fund those early on, right? And then we work with the partners to basically try and scale those technologies into those capability gaps as POM cycles start to iterate and go off of year over year. So yeah, strategically aligning capital is specifically what I would say SpaceWERX executes off of.
And riffing off of that, we as the lab are paying attention to what aerospace is doing on the FFRDC side for the DoD. We're also paying attention and talking with SpaceWERX and Space Force and DIU and understanding where those checks are getting written and seeing the companies and paying attention to all of that. So it's really important for not only the partnership with Techstars and the startups and the VCs, but government to government where we're going, and it's really critical, I think.
I would say, and we'll get to the rest of the panel in a second, I would say even to the startups here in the crowd and on the panel, it's key that you actually establish those relationships very early on, right? Because our familiarity bias tends to kick in a little bit more, and we start to work with those companies that are coming to us, working with those government customers, and they're kind of connecting the dots a little bit for us. Right, we were, again, 5 people very early onset on this mission, and now a little over 40. We need a little bit more help in connecting the dots, right, with the bigger organization. So yeah.
And what's cool for me is that, yes, we were in a 3-month program, but what we often see, and I'm sure you guys can speak to this in a moment when we get to you, is that not all of the contracts get signed in 3 months, right? Like often it's the relationships and the exploring like the total possible set of opportunities that you might be able to go after. I remember, Daniel, when you were coming to us in the program, it wasn't like I don't have enough opportunities. It was I have too many opportunities to push on, and I need help understanding which ones to go for. But what's really been cool now working with you guys for 5 years, 4 years, and some of your other colleagues for just as long, is that some of the big contracts, I'm talking like 30, 40, $50 million contracts, often stem from conversations that started in the 3-month program. I kind of want to break the tradition of just going down the line one by one by one by one with the same question. So I'm going to ask you guys as founders to just help us understand what were the first of all, tell us more about what you do and how what your big vision was, and what the first inning of the game was for you. And usually companies are coming into Techstars in their second or third inning of the game. If I'm going to use the baseball analogy, that's probably not going to last much longer than this question. But how do you think of putting one foot in front of the other so that, yes, in total, maybe you need to raise 50 or 100 or $150 million. How did you get it started, and what role did Techstars play or other early resources to help you get your companies off the ground? Maybe I'll start with Zeke and then go back to Daniel.
All right. So yeah, we signed our incorporation paperwork December 2019. We crashed a happy hour that Matt Kozlov had put on February 2020. Pretty sure we weren't invited, but we showed up and met him there, had a great time.
Village Idiot, right?
Sorry?
The Village Idiot. You're not the Village Idiot,
yeah.
yes.
I may have come across as that, but I hope I recovered from that reputation. So we went to that. Immediately after that happy hour, more or less nosedived into the pandemic. And then by May of 2020, we found ourselves sitting behind our webcams talking with Matt in the first virtual Techstars Space Accelerator program. I think 2019 had a slightly more exciting in-person interaction. But yeah, so that was kind of the founding of our company. We were definitely closer to the first inning than I think most startups were that would participate in the accelerator. But we got some really great experience. And one interesting thing that we experienced as a company was from the kind of early first few months, we managed to win 2 STTR contracts, which are great non-dilutive funding. Very exciting to get that as a startup. And so from that initial experience, we were pretty excited and pretty sure that we could bootstrap from there and kind of bootstrap the company, not have to raise venture capital. But as soon as the pandemic hit and going through the Techstars program, we realized that it's more about kind of reducing your risks and optimizing your opportunities as a startup. And that even though we had these SBIRs and STTRs available to us, a panel that Sherman was on earlier made the important note that even though these programs and grants are great for startups, they are non-recurring. So there's no guarantee that when that finishes up in 6 months, you're going to be able to get on another contract that will keep that level of funding going. So to kind of balance our opportunities there, we decided to pursue that initial venture funding guided by Matt through the Techstars program. And now as we continue to raise more money and grow as a company, we still pursue SBIRs to sort of augment and support us, but similarly we'll keep raising and kind of have Matt in our back pocket to guide us through all of those fundraising efforts. So yeah, it's been an exciting journey so far. In terms of what our company does, we're very focused on digital engineering and providing better software tools for organizations like the US Air Force, NASA, and the companies and subcontractors they work with, giving them tools to more highly optimize the designs of their systems as they're developing them from an early stage. So yeah, that's kind of my initial story. I'll hand it over to Daniel now, if that's all right.
Yeah, great. So 25 years ago, I decided that I was going to look at asteroid mining. I got my engineering degree and built a dozen satellites around the world. I grew up in Australia and there was nothing happening there. I then started building companies because no one had a vision of grand enough of the things that I wanted to work on. So OrbitFab is startup number 4. Having come out of the last startup when we sold that, I was looking at what was needed to leverage off what I'd seen in the reusable rockets, right? It's changed the paradigm on everything. The next step appeared to be obvious to me, make reusable satellites. And I started asking folks, what would it be worth if you could get fuel in orbit? Almost fell off my chair when the answer came back as $1 million of marginal revenue for every kilogram of fuel you could get, which makes sense if you think that you've got to drag so much fuel around. It costs a lot of fuel and you're on a second exponential of cost of capital. But if you can run a logistics operation, you get to create all that value, bringing that fuel at the end. So we started focused on ComSat operators who were living that every day with their older assets and that challenge that they're running out of fuel. and at these new folks that were building satellite servicing vehicles or tow trucks in space, who were going to need a lot of fuel, and if you don't have a fuel supply, you tow a satellite or two, and then you've got to replace your tow truck. That's where we started, all focused on the commercial, because I'd only moved to America a few years earlier. I didn't understand really working with the government, even on the civil side, let alone the DoD. So we realized, though, that Space Force was about to get set up. There was a lot of talk about that, and we pivoted into that by doing the Techstars program. We did it specifically because it was backed by Air Force at the time, because Space Force didn't exist. And that absolutely worked for us. So we were picking up a few small contracts, SIBRs and those kind of things. We found out that we could get to the International Space Station using the lift capacity, astronaut time that's controlled by the International Space Station National Lab, which NASA supports, but is operated separately. So we were able to do that within a year. We got 2 payloads to the space station, pumped some water back and forth. It cost us some money, but not a lot of money. And we found an investor who said, I think your idea is big enough that it might be VC backable, and I think the team will figure out what the business model is, because most startups are in that position where you really don't know what you're doing. So a large part of what we did was this pivot to focusing on the government, focused most of our business development effort there, and that really worked. So we lived through the standing up of AFWERX and then later SpaceWERX, and those contracts, they're much more streamlined now, but it took months to get those under contract. We then got a phase 2. I think it was 9 months between submitting our phase 2 proposal and getting selected, and another 6 months to get that under contract. Right? It's just the kind of things that you've got to live with. And through that time, you've just got to make it all work and stitch everything together and make demonstrative progress. So there was a lot of building relationships and seeing where they could go and building one thing on top of the other. So now we've got to about 35 million of contracts, about 30 million of investment. The company's got its legs under it, and we've sold fuel to the government for delivery in orbit. So we've built that up through the different relationships and connecting with the different parts of the government, whilst also keeping the commercial alive, because that's a huge upside for us, right? When the commercial industry switches to refueling in orbit, and we start to see fully reusable spacecraft, that's when there's going to be massive demand for fueling in orbit. But there's also huge demand for a lot of different reasons on the government side, responding to Cody's customers and the reasons that they set up that program. So we've been able to sort of leverage off both, but from the financial side, we couldn't have done this without finding support from the government. We got there through Techstars, but we've done the Panelists Accelerator, which is a smaller thing that they had a focus program on satellite servicing and refueling. We've done a number of other programs that helped us become the home team and expand those networks, so that we could more easily sort of build the relationships and get contracts. That's been totally key to what we've done. When I show our investors now our financials and our projections, our revenue to OpEx ratio blows them away. The fact that we've had contracts that have offset so much of our development is absolutely key now to, like, they can see that it's a capital efficient investment. And that gets really interesting. And then they look at where these contracts are going and the fact that we can get to revenue now so quickly and easily because we've built the relationships and a proven record of delivering on those contracts. That's been absolutely crucial now to our next phase of growth.
So obviously, grants play a role and contracts with the government play a role, and maybe it's not obvious to everyone, but it's obvious to me that venture capital plays a role as well in getting companies from point A to point B. I feel like it's too simplistic a question, Sherman, to say what role does venture capital play in these space companies. So instead, I'm going to ask you the question of, like, what mistakes do you see founders making the most that you've either worked with in the past or people who are pitching to you around the early stages, and whether they're overly reliant on grants and the government not reliant enough? Are they not focusing on commercial revenue early enough? Like, what are the things that are like red flags and green flags for you when you're meeting founders?
Yeah, so I think the number one mistake that founders make is not fully understanding the problem. It's two things: not fully understanding the problem they're trying to solve, number one, and then number two, not being able to articulate how acute that problem is. Those are the two biggest mistakes that founders make. To bring my answer to your question full circle with the question you asked before that everyone answered, SBIRs are but one part of the process from a investor standpoint, what they basically do is lower the cost of capital that it's going to take to get this company to market. I'm seeing the government as a partner of mine in ensuring that this company's technology and their product gets to market. At our fund, we did a large study. We looked at well over 1,000 successful dual-use companies. To classify them as dual-use, they raised greater than $5 million of venture capital funding. And we actually found a negative correlation between SBIR funding and those companies being deemed successful. Because we look back from we started at the year 2000, and we went up to, the first data set was to 2020. We've now updated the data set through the year 2023. There was a change that started in conjunction with that. The outcome of that data set has started to change with the introduction of the TACFI and the STRATFI program. And of course, it seems simple, but I don't know if it was simple when they decided to do it, where the government basically said, and there have been elements like this in the government before, DOE has had programs like this before, et cetera, but the government said, we'll give your startup $1 if you're able to get a matching dollar of private capital, right? So the government is kind of outsourcing some of the diligence. You can apply that to the private sector. And you start to see a change there with respect to correlations between that SBIR funding and a company being successful. And so, like Daniel, for instance, because he's won a StratFi, right? Or if I won a StratFi. And so, SBIRs are but one part of the equation. Another mistake founders would make is putting too much onus on that, right? Conversely, though, TACFI and StratFi are now becoming a real thing. TACFI, not as much because it's lower dollar amounts, but definitely a StratFi, of which there have not been that many handed out. I think there's only been about 200.
Yeah.
Hopefully that changes.
We'll be announcing a handful soon.
Yeah. Hopefully that changes, right? But StratFi is a signal to an investor that, yes, that's a demand signal. The government wants this. The government is a viable customer here. I believe that this company will have contracts in the future, and I can underwrite that and invest accordingly.
Sherman, you mentioned a comment that I think was from a different panel around SBIR funding basically getting zero credit when you're talking to investors because it's not recurring. I have a counter view on that, though, which is that I think it is necessary but not sufficient.
Same.
Like when we're looking at companies and they don't have any SBIR funding, to me, that's kind of a signal that what they're building is not interesting, or they don't know how to go after government procurement dollars, which, as far as I'm concerned, is a must-have skill set if you're going to succeed in the space sector.
I don't know if it's indicative of it, right? I think it's definitely, first line. You could assess that could be the reason that they just don't know how to go to the government.
And maybe they're too early and they haven't started yet, or they don't know how. But I don't think zero credit is the right.
First of all, it wasn't me that said
I know you didn't say it.
It was another person on the panel who will go nameless that said that. I don't put, like I said, I said when I gave my little diatribe before that SBIRs are but one portion of the process.
Yeah, correct.
I don't put too much weight in a SBIR phase 1, phase 2, and I put a little weight in a TACFI. I do put tremendous amount of weight in a StratFi. Right.
So, and that's great on the investor side. I'll talk about it real quick on the go-to-market from a government side. It's like a phase 1, phase 2, you can transition to a phase 3 sole source immediately, right? That's an unlimited IDIQ essentially. And so getting a phase 1, if you have a product that essentially you also could build that pipeline off of very early in the R&D phase, like that could be just as substantial as going through the whole life cycle of SBIRs, right? So like, again, it's not indicative. It's just a matter of like, does the team realize what it takes to get to that next level? And that's going to have to do with a lot of due diligence from the investor side, from accelerator side, right? And then the government is going to be relying, and I wouldn't say 100%, but they'll be relying on these trusted partners to help them assess which ones they're going to become vested into.
and we've kind of hit on it, but I'm just going to say the SBIR program's been around a lot longer than startups has, and we're trying to use something that was developed 40 years ago, effectively, that wasn't developed for startups. And so maybe it's time to think, and we're not going to do that right now, but on this panel, I'm sure we would have great ideas, but the SBIR and trying to apply it to startups, it's kind of putting a round peg in a square hole,
Well, and so just getting back to like the trusted partners piece is like, this is why we've started to integrate and align with how DIU is executing, right? Their larger budget that they got approved for. And how can we be a piece of this puzzle that essentially maybe it's us on the very early side, right? Funding them on the phase 1, phase 2 side, and then DIU coming in, augmenting it with larger dollars, right? Like these are things we've been strategizing on. And again, it's not a one size fits all. It's a matter of each company is going to have a different go-to-market strategy pretty much every single time. So again, it's on the companies as well to build those relationships with the DIUs of the world, with I would even say on the congressional side, right? And all of that, right? Because they all play into a factor of when you start to get to these larger dollar amounts, specifically on the cyber side, right? So stratify, tactful.
I'll plug you because I don't know if every startup is thinking about a DC lobbying strategy at this stage, but we have several companies who, right after they raise their seed or Series A, start figuring out, okay, like what's our lobbying strategy? Because if you are able to get congressional budget allocation for your technology eventually working its way through the budget, there's money at the end of the rainbow. And if you can work that game, you're finding and paying for yourself years in advance.
100%.
So one thing I do want to address, I want to piggyback on that really quickly. You have a lot of defense tech companies, space tech companies, et cetera, that say they want to be primes. SpaceX has vertically integrated. A lot of this stuff is consolidated down at Starbase, right? They are N of one, and they have a lead time right now because other folks have not caught up yet. People will eventually catch up. That's how life works. But you need to understand how the primes work. A Lockheed Martin will build a fuselage in this state. They'll build a wing in that state, right? The nose cone for the aircraft will be in this other state. They're doing that for a reason, to get Congress to buy in on those programs. And a lot of startups do not have that vision, do not have that ability to go get those K Street lobbyists and basically run a campaign against these congressmen and get them to vote on these bills and to use their product, right? So that's something that's yet the next level that we need to step into.
It's not even like next level, right? Like everyone needs to be doing it now, right? Like this should be part of the game plan from step one. And like on the government side, we don't advocate for it, but we realize it's part of the solution to get you towards those bigger dollar amounts.
Because as everyone should know, Congress controls the purse strings. The majority of space money is coming out of DoD and to a little bit lesser degree, NASA, right? And Congress controls that money, so you have to appeal to them.
All right, I'm going to start sprinkling in questions from the audience, and please keep asking more questions. Also, if you guys have questions for the panel. The cold start problem is different with component technologies that may require tens of millions of development dollars than it is for large capabilities like launch that need hundreds of millions or more. Can you explain the different solutions available for each? Does anyone want to chime in with that?
I'll take that because we're trying to build a complete fuel supply chain in orbit. In fact, I want to become the downstream oil and gas company in space where we have the refineries, the storage, the distribution, and sales. To build all of that, we started with a gas cap. Right? We started with a component because it was a key part of what we needed to do, but also because it was something we could bite off. And it was obvious that there was going to be a demand for that once everybody had that paradigm shift to wanting refueling. So building a strategy of what do we start with today, what's that first step in order to build a huge vision is really important. My previous company, Deep Space Industries, our big, hairy, audacious goal was asteroid mining. That will forever contextualize everything I do. In order to bootstrap that one, we started building small thrusters to move satellites in and around in orbit. And to get into the thruster game, we built a steam kettle. We built a water-based thruster that just heated up the water and injected superheated steam, which was so boring and so obvious that people were buying it before we had even got a first prototype built. So it was a matter of finding something small to get started on, that we could find people that would pay for it and be able to move that technology forward. So that's really, from me, been the key of sort of my entrepreneurial learning, is the go-to-market strategy and that very first thing that you can get out the door. Prove you can execute, prove you can bring a product to market. And even a gas cap, it's costing us millions of dollars to get that qualified. The thrusters that we built, the glorified steam kettle thrusters, that cost a few $1 million. Like, making a product is not easy, no matter what the product is and how simple it seems. Making a complex system like an on-orbit refueling system and refineries in orbit, right? That's a years or decades-long challenge that we've set ourselves, which helps to inspire us, right? We're going to build something amazing, but we've got to focus all of our efforts today on the one thing that's going to move the needle and getting that one first product out the door.
To add to that, one thing that I've noticed with these startups is the companies that have a gas cap, do refueling in space, they have that minimum viable product. They understand the customer discovery, and something that the government's been doing through the not Ignite, but the I-Corps program at NSF, or DOE has a similar program, is really getting researchers out there or technologists out there to understand what the product landscape is and what they're trying to sell. And I think that hits on what you're saying, and that when I first started hearing about I-Corps, it didn't make sense to me. But now that I've sat through this for a few years, it makes complete sense. Focus on what you're trying to sell. Don't try to sell everything.
All right, SBIR money seems like a great way to get off the ground, but is there a point at which a company gets too many SBIRs to be taken seriously by investors?
Yes.
The treadmill.
Yeah, I mean, you become, you don't want to take on SBIR money, and I've seen this a lot. I have a background in the life sciences. I was an M&A banker in the life sciences, and I would see companies that would come to us with, they've gotten $70 to $90 million of NIH funding, plus some grant funding from like Clinton Global Initiative or Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And they would go, well, based off of this money we've taken on, we should be like a $200-300 million company. And then we look at them and like, you're like probably a $30 million company. Like, it just kind of is what it is. So the key there is you need to get information from the market with respect to what your value is. So you can be crush it with SBIR, but I always encourage to take even a little bit of money of dilutive capital from investors, so that you're testing, so you can get that market valuation, you can get that real-time test. If you're not generating cash flows, it's tough to assess the intrinsic value of your company. Therefore, the only way I can test it is via comps and precedents. And that's really the market. I need to understand what the market is saying. So you can't just have SBIR money. You do want to test yourself in the market to some degree.
I want to praise the SpaceWERX program for a moment. I mentioned that it took us like 9 months to get selected and 6 months to get under contract. When we got under contract, some of the things that we had in there we'd already done. Right? We weren't slowing down and stopping for the SBIR process. And I see companies do that where they'll wait because they know they're getting an SBIR and it's just got to get under contract, and they'll slow down the development. But the most important thing was we then went back to the program manager for that StratFi and the phase 2 SBIRs that we had, and we were able to renegotiate to the deliverables, like what are the most important things that need to get done from where we are today, right at the start of the project. How far can we get? Can we get further than what we said, because we've already done a few of these milestones? In some government contracting mechanisms, that's hard or impossible to do. We saw flexibility in the SpaceWERX program, and it was really important. That gave me confidence that we should be going after the bigger StratFi and the like, because otherwise you can derail your program. And it's easy to apply for things that are non-core and get distracted. Don't do it. You lose that discipline, and now you spend $100 million building $30 million of value. That's a waste of time.
Yeah, I would just add to that I think it's important to have a strategy with any SBIRs or SIDRs that you're doing of how that effort is going to impact your core technology. And there are a lot of topics you can kind of squint at and think that it'll in some way help you build out capabilities, but if it's deviating too much from your core focus, that's when I think VCs start to become concerned. If you're bringing in, $500 million of SBIRs, you don't really have a core product that you're building. You're just kind of following that treadmill.
All right, we have 58 seconds left, so I'll probably just wrap us up. Thanks to all of our panelists. I had a good time. I hope you guys had a good time. You laughed, you lived, you learned. If any of you are interested in learning more about our program, how to get involved, whether as a mentor or a partner, or if you have a company that you're looking to get funded, usually companies are sort of TRL 3 through 7 is sort of when we're usually focusing on. You can reach out to me. I'm Matt Kozlov, matt.kozlov@techstars.com. You can find me on LinkedIn. I'll probably stand here for a little bit, and maybe your panelists will stick around for a bit as well. Thanks all for joining us.